Every Nation pastors, if you're like me, you have probably had enough of looking at cameras and speaking into cameras, and you've had enough of watching other people do that as well. I can't wait to get back to corporate gatherings where we're actually gathered and we're actually not just watching church, but participating in church. And I know you can't wait to get back to that as well. And I am trusting that there will be thousands, maybe tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of people around the world who, when we're able to meet, will start joining with us because they watched a worship service online, and now for the first time they're really interested in checking it out. I've heard reports about online people in non-Christian nations all over the world who would never go to a church service, but they have been watching our online services, and I believe many of them will visit when we're able to gather again. But let me give you a few thoughts about a worship service, especially since we're doing them online. And here's what a worship service is all about. Remember, we're not doing a talk show. We're not news anchors. We're not doing a blog or a vlog or whatever other thing there might be. We're doing a worship service. And worship services need worship leaders, and that worship leader is you. I don't mean singer. I mean worship leader. You're the one as the senior leader leading the congregation in worship. And I know it's a challenge when we're doing it online, when we're looking into a screen in an empty room like I'm doing right now. But here are a few thoughts. Throughout church history, a worship service began with a call to worship. And often in ancient days, that was a bell tower in the middle of the town ringing these massive bells, and people knew it's time to worship. It's time to gather for worship. Sometimes that's an organ playing, and people know it's time to come out of the foyer and out of the gardens and come in to worship. There are different ways to do that, but what we're doing is calling God's people together and saying, it is now time to shift gears. It is time to worship. The next hour, the next hour and a half, for some places in the world, the next 3 hours. It doesn't matter, but it is a call out of the world to a sacred place. And we have to do that even when we're calling people to worship online. We're calling them out of something to a sacred place of worship. Now that worship starts, now that people are called together, here are the main components of worship. We worship in song. It's unique to the Christian faith. Worship in song. It's not a concert, and I think what's happening online, a lot of people are stripping down their music portion of worship, and I think that's a good thing because people are actually hearing the lyrics maybe for the first time, and they're actually following not a concert type atmosphere, but singing songs of worship. Besides worship and song, then typically comes worship and sermon. And those of you who are preaching, it's so important that you see it's not worship and then word. No, it's worship and song and now worship through the sermon. They're both parts of a worship service. They're not separated. And I think when we preach, we want to see our preaching as our worship to God. And the people who are receiving the preaching should be receiving that. And the way they hear a sermon, the way we hear a sermon is our worship to God. So there's worship in song, there's worship in sermon, then there's worship in the sacraments. And church traditions do it differently. They do it different frequencies and different parts of the service, but the worship and sacrament, where there's a real sense and a real encounter with the risen Christ. One of my Asbury professors said it like this in a chapel service. He was asked by a child, what do we believe about communion? And of course, he was a Methodist, and so he said, well, we don't believe quite as much as the Catholics, but we believe more than the Baptist. So in other words, we don't believe that Jesus physically, literally, his body, the bread turns into his body, like the Catholics, but we don't believe it's just simply a symbol. We believe there's something supernatural and something special of his presence that meets us in the communion table. So there's worship in song, there's worship in sermon, there's worship in sacraments, and throughout history, most worship services had a time of supplication. Supplication is the kind of prayer where we're pleading with God specifically for specific answers to prayers. And I think it's a powerful thing when the church comes together and prays in unity. Right now, all over the world, churches are praying together. Millions of believers, thousands and thousands of churches are praying 2 Chronicles 7:14 together and asking God in unity to heal their lands and to heal our lands. And that's part of a worship service, is that supplication type of prayer. And so it starts with a call to worship, a call out, and then it's songs and sermons and sacrament and supplication, prayer. And then the worship service is over. Now it's ascending. There was a calling together, and now there's a sending or a scattering back into the world to be witnesses of God's power and witnesses of the gospel. We're called together to worship, to be equipped so that we can be sent back into the world. So listen, when you're doing an online worship service, remember, it is a worship service. And there are components and elements of a worship service that are a little bit different when we're doing it online, but they're vital that you as the worship leader, leading your people in worship, that you incorporate these elements into your worship time. Listen, God bless you as you preach and lead your people into worship. And I can't wait until we can actually do this face-to-face again at some of our conferences around the world. God bless you.